And I think we're live. So today I just wanted to talk about the issue of free expression and how I think the United States is sort of slouching into the into becoming more and more like the rest of the world, particularly our neighbors in North Canada and Europe, where you can get fined and censured and occasionally thrown into prison for saying something that the authorities do not like. And I bring this up because of a recent decision in the ongoing, very prolonged case involving Andrew Anglin, who's a white supremacist blogger. Some people call him a troll. Uh, However you describe him, he's basically a neo-Nazi who had a website that was deplatformed and removed from the internet after in the wake of the Charlottesville incident where Heather Heyer was run over and there were clashes between white supremacists and Antifa riders. So this occasioned a crackdown on the quote unquote alt-right, but the crackdown and the deplatforming wasn't limited to the alt-right. It encompassed basically anyone who had right of center opinions on certain issues like immigration or Islam. Robert Spencer, his payment service processor was deplatformed him. So you had people not only being removed from social media websites, you had the payment to them stopped. Bosch Faustine is another. He won the Garland Mohammed art exhibition, which was attacked by two jihadis, and he's been repeatedly deplatformed on Twitter, Instagram, and so forth. And I think the Andrew Anglin case, where they decided that his online postings weren't protected under the First Amendment, that they constituted harassment, I think this is a kind of a watershed moment, even though it's a lower court. This hasn't, presumably this could be appealed to the Supreme Court, but I think this is something that's going to change the way free speech is viewed in the United States. And it's interesting because in the aftermath of Charlottesville, I don't think many people are willing to defend Andrew Anglin's statements because, as I said, he's a neo-Nazi, and he's a very sort of, whether you think he's doing this by design, and he actually is a neo-Nazi, or whether you think this is all some sort of jocular, sarcastic, quote unquote troll persona, he's not a very likable individual. So no one was willing to defend not his philosophical or political viewpoints, which are risible, but defend his right to express them, except for Tucker Carlson, who, in a very courageous broadcast, stood up for the idea of free speech, even if it's free speech that's grossly offensive. And the idea behind the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, particularly, is that it's enshrined in our Constitution in order to defend rights categorically. There's no hate speech exception, because if there were, it would nullify the intent behind the amendment. It would basically make free speech contingent upon the views of whoever's in power. And to paraphrase the late Joe Sobran, any speech, hate speech is any speech that liberals hate. So it would allow whoever's in power and to restrict free speech. And now that liberals and the left and progressives do not like free speech because they're ensconced in power, when they were oppositional figures, they enjoyed free speech to the hilt. They would defend Soviet assets and communists to speak their mind because it undermined the government they were fighting against. It wasn't a principled stance in support of free expression. It was in support of people whose values they shared. And this ties in. This ties in to the ACLU's recent tweet, and there have been a number of good articles about this, particularly by David E. Bernstein on Reason.com on their blog, which describe how this tweet embodies what the ACLU stands for right now. And it's not a broad defense of civil liberties. It's basically a left-wing social justice affinity group. That's what the ACLU represents right now. And David Bernstein goes through this, how it evolved from a civil liberties organization in the 60s and 70s into what's now essentially an affinity group for the left, like the NAACP or the League of Conservation Voters or the Sierra Club, which also abandoned its commitment to environmentalism when it conflicted with a higher liberal priority, that is open borders and mass immigration. But like them, the League of Women Voters, the Brennan Center, any of these groups, they're basically liberal left-wing interest groups. Despite what, and Bernstein points this out, that might occasionally defend civil liberties if the person being censured or prosecuted is a liberal, and their civil liberties are being infringed upon. They might defend them just because they're being targeted. But if a conservative or a libertarian or someone on the right or even the alt-right, if their civil liberties are being encroached upon, they won't defend them. And this is the Anglin case is a perfect example of this. Like I said, Tucker Carlson is the only one who came to the defense of his civil rights, his civil liberties, because what the court did yesterday. They're essentially saying he had a blog post which said called for a troll storm, quote unquote. In other words, just to harass a woman named Tanya Gersh through online screeds and just in essence being a nuisance and doxing. And I just like to make this clear. I find those tactics to be deplorable. even though they're used mostly by the left, and it's a left wing tactic in essence that was appropriated by the alt right, but or an Antifa tactic specifically that was appropriated by the alt right, but he made it clear in the disclaimer at the bottom that he disavowed any sort of violent assault or anything criminal against her, and yet the judge still ruled that he was culpable in a civil lawsuit. And this is one of the strategies it's been used to attack alt-right vehicles and personalities to essentially bankrupt them and sue them. And it was a strategy pioneered by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Now, they launched a lawsuit against the Ku Klux Klan for a KKK member who actually did commit a violent act and murdered someone, and they tried to sue them civilly and wound up recouping millions of dollars and essentially forcing this group, this KKK neo-Nazi group, into bankruptcy. What they're doing now is they're targeting people whose opinions, regardless of whether you condemn them or they find approbation with you, it doesn't matter what their, like, however disgusting you think their views are. They're still protected free speech, and they're trying to civilly bankrupt people for expressing their point of view, even if it's being expressed in a very noxious way. And it's very dangerous because people look at this and they say, why should we defend neo-Nazis and white supremacists and these? Because these people view this group as simply the one point on a spectrum of anyone who's not a doctrinaire leftist, who's not progressive and a social justice warrior. So if you believe in limiting immigration or critiquing Islam, if you're still a target. Like, it doesn't matter if you're Robert Spencer or Richard Spencer, they still want to destroy you. They don't just want to deplatform you. They want to immiserate you and make it so that you can't express your point of view. For example, Gab, one of the ironic defenses from the left of deplatforming is that Twitter is a private website. Now, most of the people saying this are socialists and Marxists who don't believe in private property, but the Gab was a solution to a wave of deplatforming, and yet they decided to attack Gab because someone who used it, the murderer in the Pennsylvania synagogue, had posted on Gab, ironically, not anything violent. He had posted violent comments on Twitter, and yet no one was demanding that Twitter be shuttered. And the fact that it was an independent platform, it doesn't matter. Even if they had successfully locked people out of Twitter and mainstream social media platforms, they still wanted to censor other platforms that were created by people who they despise. And the ACLU, that story that of their tweet, which basically expressed outrage that under the new Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, men in Title IX proceedings would be able to cross-examine their accusers, which is it's a cornerstone of the Bill of Rights. And the ACLU, which touts itself as a defender of the Constitution, said that expressed outrage that someone would extend those liberties to men undergoing Title IX proceedings in sexual harassment or sexual assault cases. And this just embodies how the organization is a complete fraud, and they're not going to stand up for civil liberties. And this is something most of us already knew. If they had the people who read Nat Hentoff and Wendy Kaminer and other former members or supporters of the ACLU, Michael Myers from the New York Civil Rights and the NYACLU, who used to be a big time proponent of them, have for years they've shown how they don't care about the Constitution or basic civil liberties, and that they're hypocrites. They don't defend the Second. First of all, in terms of the Bill of Rights, they don't defend the Second Amendment. They don't, and the Constitution. They don't defend the Equal Protection Clause because they support racial quotas. But this latest tweet exposes how they just don't defend the Constitution in general. Not even parts of the Constitution that they dislike. They don't defend any of it if it conflicts with their commitment to feminism or social justice or gay rights. They, of course, stood against the bakers who chose to exercise their freedom of association. So they're not going to stand up for us. And it's clear that a lot of people don't understand how critical this is. Things like the Anglin case, it's unpopular to defend the rights of someone who's considered anathema to the rest of society. But if you don't defend someone's civil rights, if you make someone's civil liberties contingent upon them having acceptable political opinions, you're not going to have any rights. You're not going to be the only people able to exercise rights are those in the government or whom the government deems acceptable. And I think this is a big issue that people are going to have to deal with, because you're going to see this applied across the board. It's not just neo-Nazis and white supremacists. Soon people like Robert Spencer are going to be, I hope it doesn't come to this, but they're going to be brought into court and harassed by people like the SPLC and anti-American, anti-constitutional organizations on the left, because they don't subscribe to the progressive stack, and they deign to criticize one of their favored groups, and it's going to be a mess. We'll see what happens. I mean, hopefully we don't end up in the same place as Canada. We don't have American human rights commissions that drag people into a star chamber like they did with Ezra Levant and Mark Stein for criticizing Islam. But I'm afraid that's where we're headed if we don't nip this in the bud.